Admiral Michael Thornton stood at the helm of the United Human Command flagship Eclipse, gazing out the viewport into the vast unknown of deep space. His fleet, a formidable force composed of 30 ships from every corner of human space, was poised for an expedition into the uncharted sector of the galaxy. The mission was one of exploration, but also of conquest. Humanity's dominance over the stars was at stake, and Thornton believed firmly that no challenge was too great for the might of his fleet. He had led countless missions before, but this one felt different, not in any substantial way, but a subtle unease gnawed at him. Nevertheless, he shook it off and turned to the bridge crew with a commanding smile, his confidence unshakable. "Everything is in place. We move out on schedule," Thornton said, his voice carrying authority and assurance across the bridge. Dr. Lucas Hayes, the fleet's lead scientist, approached with a slight hesitation. He was known for his meticulous approach to everything, especially the anomalies in the sector ahead. Strange fluctuations in sensor readings had been detected long before the fleet's departure, but Thornton had dismissed the warnings as typical space interference things that were common in regions like this. Unexplored and unstable. Dr. Hayes had tried to raise concerns multiple times over the past few weeks, but each time he had been met with the same stern response from the Admiral. "Admiral, we've been receiving strange signals from that area of space. I recommend a full scan before we proceed further. It might not be just natural phenomena," Dr. Hayes said, his voice laced with concern. Thornton glanced at the scientist, a flicker of impatience crossing his face, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "Dr. Hayes, we've run all the scans we need to, and this is nothing more than cosmic background radiation, nothing we haven't seen before. We're the most advanced fleet in human history. I'm not going to let a few anomalies keep us from our objective." Thornton's tone was firm and final. Dr. Hayes nodded reluctantly and returned to his station. The crew knew better than to question the Admiral too openly, but the unease lingered. It was something in the air, something everyone felt, but no one dared to voice aloud. As the fleet made its way into the uncharted sector, the first signs of trouble came quickly. The Eclipse's sensors began to pick up strange signals, faint but persistent. The crew was on edge as strange patterns started to emerge. It was as if the very fabric of space was warping around them, but Thornton remained unmoved. "We're just dealing with a little interference from the ion storms ahead, nothing to worry about," he assured the crew. But even as he said it, there was a subtle tension in his voice that betrayed his certainty. Then the first anomaly appeared. It wasn't anything large or threatening, but a sudden blip on the radar, something that didn't belong. The ship rocked slightly, as if brushed by an unseen force, and a few systems blinked out for a moment. "Sir, we've lost power to several secondary systems," reported Lieutenant Emma Carter, the operations officer. Her fingers flew over the control panel, trying to stabilize the ship's systems. "Just a temporary glitch. We're moving forward," Thornton snapped and waved off the situation with a dismissive hand. The fleet pressed on undeterred as the vast expanse of space stretched before them, undisturbed by the tiny specks of human technology daring to explore its depths. But something waited in the dark reaches of space, something old and vast and hungry. But for now, the fleet sailed onward, unaware of the danger closing in with every passing moment. The fleet continued its journey through the vast expanse, and each passing day added to the weight of Thornton's decision to press forward despite the increasing anomalies. The strange interference persisted, becoming more erratic. Every so often, a ship would report momentary sensor failures or brief distortions in communications, but nothing that could be directly explained. Most of the crew chalked it up to the peculiar nature of unexplored space, brushing off any thoughts of deeper danger. But for Dr. Lucas Hayes, the unease only grew. He could feel something lurking just outside their perception, an ancient force that was slowly encroaching on the fleet's path. As the fleet ventured further into the heart of the unknown sector, the signal distortions became harder to ignore. Every ship in the fleet was now reporting strange readings, some worse than others. The eerie signals seemed to pulse in rhythm with their movements, as though something was studying them from afar. It was unsettling, but Admiral Thornton refused to change course. He knew how important this mission was, and no number of minor setbacks would deter him from achieving his goal. That's when it happened. The first ship vanished without warning. The U.S. Valor, a heavy cruiser with an experienced crew, was the first to completely disappear. The ship had been trailing the Eclipse, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. A routine check-in had been made not long before, but when the fleet attempted to reach out for the next scheduled transmission, there was nothing but static. The signal was lost, and with it, the Valor. Where is the Valor? Thornton demanded, his eyes narrowing as he stood in the command center of the Eclipse. Report. Lieutenant Carter, her fingers flying across the controls, looked up with disbelief. Sir, we've tried everything. Short-range communications, long-range. There's no response. No sign of the ship. It's just gone. A tense silence filled the bridge. The magnitude of what had just occurred began to settle over the crew. A ship lost without a trace in the middle of open space. Yet Thornton refused to show concern. Probably just a temporary malfunction, a system failure, he said, his voice tight with frustration. We've seen worse. Keep the fleet moving. But Dr. Hayes stood from his station, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. Admiral, this isn't a malfunction. Something's out there. Something we don't understand. Thornton turned sharply, fixing Hayes with a hard stare. This is the real world, Dr. Hayes. There are no ghosts in space. We press on. The Valor is lost, but we move forward. We can't afford to turn back. Dr. Hayes tried to speak, but Thornton cut him off with a wave of his hand. The scientist's warnings were falling on deaf ears. The fleet continued onward, unwilling to acknowledge the true danger lurking just beyond their sight. A few hours later, the Valor was joined by another ship, a frigate, the Bravery. It too went silent without warning, and then another, and another. With each disappearance, the remaining ships grew more uneasy, their crews growing increasingly tense, questioning the leadership, questioning the decisions that had brought them this far. But still, Admiral Thornton's resolve did not waver. He told them to focus on the mission, to stay on course and fight through whatever challenges arose. Then came the eerie realization. Every ship that vanished left no wreckage, no debris, not even a trace. They were simply erased from existence. And as the last ship, the Lone Star, disappeared, the fleet was left with only 8 remaining ships, surrounded by the cold emptiness of space. And in that silence, the question arose, what had happened to them? There were no answers, only the increasing sense that the fleet was no longer alone. The entity was coming, and they had no way to stop it. The final struggle had already begun. The Eclipse trembled violently, the walls of the ship groaning under an unnatural pressure. The hum that had filled the air earlier now escalated into a deafening roar, vibrating through the very core of the vessel. The crew braced themselves against the shock waves, their eyes wide with fear, unable to comprehend what was happening. The lights flickered in strobe-like bursts, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to warp and distort around them. Get to the escape pods! Thornton yelled, his voice cracked with desperation. But even as the words left his mouth, the futility of them settled over him like a weight. They had no chance of escaping. Not with the entity's grasp tightening around them. They were trapped, and the Eclipse was slowly being consumed. Lieutenant Carter scrambled to her station, her hands trembling as she worked feverishly to send a final distress signal. It's no use, she shouted, her voice breaking. The communication systems are completely dead. There's no way to reach anyone. Admiral Thornton's face was pale, his eyes unfocused as he stared at the vast, shifting form outside. The entity had become something more than a shadow in the void. It had taken shape, a swirling mass of cosmic energy and darkness that seemed to pulse with a cold, indifferent intelligence. It had been toying with them, pushing them further into its grasp, and now it was ready to finish what it had started. We failed, Hayes muttered under his breath, his voice hollow. He'd had spent so long warning them, trying to make sense of the data, but now it was too late. The Eclipse had crossed the threshold, one that humanity could never return from. We never stood a chance, Carter whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her face was a mask of fear and resignation. The ship lurched again, and the ground beneath them seemed to ripple, the laws of physics themselves bending in ways they couldn't understand. The entity outside shifted once again, its massive form filling the viewport. Its presence was suffocating, a vast, overwhelming force that seemed to eclipse everything around it. There was no escape from its reach, no weapon that could destroy it, no way to fight what was beyond the stars, beyond the very fabric of the universe itself. The hum was now a deafening roar, and the entire ship was vibrating with an intensity that made it feel as though the hull itself was about to tear apart. The crew tried to move, tried to act, but it was as though they were frozen in place, held by the pull of the entity's will. No one spoke. No one moved. They were all trapped in the same nightmare, bound by the inescapable fate that awaited them. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, a wave of realization washing over him. The anomaly wasn't just a physical force. It was a presence, an intelligence that had been waiting, biding its time. And now it was finally awake. It didn't need them. It didn't want anything from them. It was simply there, existing beyond the reach of time and space, a force that had watched humanity's rise and fall and had waited for the moment when they would stumble into its domain. The ship shook once more, harder this time. The floor beneath them cracked and split, and the walls of the eclipse began to warp and distort, bending under the pressure. The bridge crew clung to their consoles as the ship's systems sputtered and died. The lights went out completely, leaving them in total darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence of the void. Then the final blow came. The ship seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls, the floor, everything around them shattered into a cascade of blinding white light, and for an instant, the crew saw the face of the entity, a vast, incomprehensible presence that filled the very stars themselves. It wasn't a face, not in any way they understood. It was a vast, shifting collection of energy, a swirling mass of cosmic matter that existed beyond the boundaries of time and space. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to convey its utter indifference. The eclipse disintegrated in an instant, torn apart by an invisible force. The remaining fragments of the ship were scattered into the vast emptiness, lost forever. The crew, their struggles, their fear, all of it vanished without a trace. The anomaly, the entity, had consumed them. And as the last remnants of the fleet were absorbed into the dark void, the entity moved on, its attention already focused on something new, something beyond the fleeting presence of humankind. The stars returned to their places in the sky, indifferent to the brief moment of humanity's existence. The anomaly was silent once again, and in the deep, timeless silence of space, there was only the endless, cold expanse, untouched by the fleeting lives of those who had dared to venture too far. The remaining ships of the fleet, now reduced to only 5, drifted through the dark expanse of the anomaly, the vast void of space pressing in from all sides. The unsettling silence had become unbearable. Every few minutes, the fleet would catch a glimpse of something, a flicker on the edge of the sensor array, a distorted image on a monitor. But when they tried to investigate, it was always gone. The crew could feel it now, the weight of something unseen pressing down on them. They were being watched, hunted, and there was nothing they could do to escape. Admiral Thornton's resolve was starting to crack. He had maintained his composure for as long as possible, but now, with every new disappearance, with every new signal lost, doubt had begun to creep into his mind. He stood on the bridge of the eclipse, staring out into the endless expanse beyond, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at him. He had led fleets before, had faced enemy forces, hostile territories, but this was different. This wasn't a battle he could fight. This wasn't something he could command. "We can't keep going," Lieutenant Carter spoke up quietly from her station. "The sensors are failing. The communications are shot. The anomaly's getting stronger, and it's affecting everything. We need to stop. We need to turn back." Thornton glared at her, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. "We don't turn back, Carter. We press forward. This is the most important mission humanity has ever undertaken. I won't abandon it." Carter's eyes were wide with growing fear, her hands trembling as she continued to work the console. "Admiral, something is out there. Something is manipulating the entire fleet, picking us off one by one. We're not going to make it if we don't change course." But Thornton refused to listen. The eclipse was his command, his responsibility, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. He couldn't. The crew of the remaining ships began to fall into a nervous tension, as if they knew something was coming. They were waiting, trying to prepare themselves for what was inevitable. Dr. Lucas Hayes had finally been allowed to speak again. Thornton had listened to him less and less, but Hayes still held a position of respect among the senior officers, and he had become the voice of reason as the rest of the fleet spiraled into madness. "The readings are getting worse," Hayes said, his voice strained as he reviewed the latest data. "The anomaly is no longer just a disturbance. It's bending space-time. The closer we get to its core, the worse it gets. This intelligence, it's not just watching us. It's playing with us, and the more we resist, the more it takes." Carter nodded grimly. "It's already taken so much of us. The Lone Star, the Nightfall, the Valor. Every ship that's gone silent didn't just disappear. It was erased, pulled into something far worse than any of us can understand." "Enough of this," Thornton snapped, his patience finally breaking. "You're all panicking. I won't have it. We press forward. That's an order." His voice was commanding, but even as he spoke, a creeping doubt began to spread among the crew. How could they continue? How could they fight what they didn't understand? Then, as if in response to their mounting fear, something shifted in the darkness of space. The eclipse shook violently, as if it had been struck by a great force. The ship's lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the stars outside the viewport blurred and twisted into something unfamiliar, shapes that seemed to move, to pulse, like eyes watching them. The hum of the engines faltered, and the bridge crew fell into a stunned silence. "What was that?" Carter asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keep calm," Thornton ordered, his voice trembling more than he wanted to admit. "It's nothing. Just a gravitational fluctuation. We're fine." But Hayes wasn't convinced. He knew what they were seeing wasn't a natural occurrence. He knew they were being dragged deeper into the heart of something that had no mercy for their arrogance. "We've crossed the line, Admiral," Hayes said quietly, his face pale with fear. "Whatever's out there, it's awake now, and we can't stop it." Before Thornton could respond, the ship shuddered again, and this time, it wasn't just a brief moment. The eclipse rocked violently, sending crew members tumbling across the bridge. The lights blinked out, and the emergency alarms began blaring, a shrill warning that cut through the confusion. "This is it," Hayes whispered, eyes wide with terror. "It's coming." The eclipse lurched once more, and then nothing. The screens went black. The communications went silent. They were no longer alone. The silence was absolute. The emergency alarms had stopped, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that seemed to pulse with a malevolent force. The crew of the Eclipse was frozen, stunned by the sudden and complete loss of all power. The ship, once a symbol of humanity's technological prowess, was now a drifting husk in the cold void, vulnerable and helpless. Admiral Thornton stood at the front of the bridge, his hands clenched into fists, his face flushed with frustration and fear. The lights flickered back on, but the atmosphere on the bridge had shifted. His crew was no longer looking to him for guidance. They were looking to survive. "Status report," Thornton barked, his voice shaky but demanding. Lieutenant Carter was the first to respond, her voice tight with stress. "Sir, we've lost all communication with the fleet. All systems are down. Navigation, weapons, sensors, everything. We're completely blind." Thornton gritted his teeth, his gaze shifting toward the viewport. Outside, the stars had twisted, their familiar positions in the night sky unrecognizable. It was as though the very fabric of space had been warped by an invisible hand. In the distance, a massive shadow loomed, an outline that defied all logic. Its presence felt rather than seen. It was as though the anomaly itself had taken form, something vast and incomprehensible, looming just beyond the veil of reality. Dr. Lucas Hayes stood to the side, his face pale and etched with fear. He had spent the past several days analyzing the data, watching as the crew dismissed his warnings, as the fleet pressed forward into the unknown. Now, with everything spiraling into chaos, he had no words of reassurance, only a grim certainty that the fleet was already lost. "It's here," Hayes said quietly, his voice barely audible. "We're inside it now. Whatever intelligence has been playing with us, it's awake." The crew shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to believe him or not. But deep down, they could all feel it. The air on the bridge seemed thicker, heavier, as if the very space around them had been altered. The hum of the ship's remaining systems seemed distorted, like a broken tune echoing through an alien landscape. "Are you telling me that this thing is alive?" Thornton demanded, his voice barely concealing his panic. "That's impossible. It's just a phenomenon, some natural." "It's not natural, Admiral," Hayes interrupted, his voice sharper than usual. "This entity, or whatever it is, has intelligence, purpose. It's been waiting for us, watching us. It's been manipulating the fleet, drawing us closer, like prey to a trap." A chilling realization spread through the room as the crew began to understand. They weren't just lost in space. They had walked into the territory of something far beyond their comprehension, something that had been watching humanity from the shadows, and now it was closing in on them. The ship trembled again, this time much more violently. A deep rumbling sound filled the air, reverberating through the ship's hull as if some monstrous force was shifting just outside their walls. The lights flickered once more, casting the room in strobe-like bursts of dim light. Then, in a moment of pure dread, the viewport displayed something that took everyone's breath away. A massive shape appeared in the distance, an enormous, floating mass, dark and formless. It seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the Eclipse's view, an entity of incomprehensible size. The shape was constantly shifting, warping, like a vast creature moving through the very fabric of space, its surface a shifting, undulating mass of stars, shadow, and something far darker. The Eclipse shook again, this time so violently that several officers were thrown to the floor. The ship's remaining systems flickered in and out of existence. The entity outside seemed to pulse with energy, its movements synchronized with the ship's every motion, as if it were drawing closer with each passing second. "What the hell is that?" Lieutenant Carter gasped, her voice filled with terror. "What is it doing to us?" "It's not just a ship or a creature," Hayes whispered, his voice trembling. It's a consciousness, a force. It's alive in ways we can't even begin to understand, and we're trapped in its grasp." As the last of the fleet's ships vanished, leaving the Eclipse stranded alone in the anomaly, Thornton's resolve finally shattered. He had led his fleet into the jaws of an ancient intelligence, a being whose motives were beyond comprehension. And now there was no escape. The entity outside shifted again, and the ship seemed to groan under an unseen pressure. Whatever was watching them, whatever was controlling the fate of the fleet, was ready to finish what it had started. And in that moment, the crew realized they were no longer in control of their own destiny. They were mere spectators, trapped in the waking nightmare of a force they could never hope to defeat. The pressure inside the Eclipse was unbearable. The ship groaned and rattled under an unseen force, as if something enormous was pressing against its hull. The crew stumbled through the corridors, their every step feeling heavier, as though the very gravity of their existence was being twisted. The viewport, once a window to the vastness of space, now displayed a vision that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. The massive entity loomed outside, its shifting form ever present, drawing closer with every heartbeat. Admiral Thornton stood on the bridge, hands gripping the console, his face pale with fear. He had never known such helplessness. His crew, his fleet, had been reduced to nothing. Every attempt to communicate with the other ships had been in vain. Every sensor, every weapon, every system had failed. They were alone. They were trapped. And the entity outside, whatever it was, had no intention of letting them go. "We need to get out of here," Lieutenant Carter said, her voice breaking with tension as she desperately worked at her console, trying to regain control of the ship's systems. "We need to find a way to break free from this thing." But Thornton's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't think straight. The once unshakable leader of the fleet now felt like a man on the brink of collapse, his pride shattered, his resolve crumbling under the weight of what was happening. "I can't just leave," Thornton muttered, his voice hollow. "I can't just abandon everything we've worked for." Carter shook her head. "You don't understand, Admiral. It's not just about the fleet anymore. It's about survival. It's about getting out of here while we still have a chance." Before Thornton could respond, the ship jolted again, harder this time. The lights flickered, and the screens began to glitch, distorting images of the entity outside. It was growing larger, its shape taking on something far more defined. An enormous, shifting mass of darkness, its surface a storm of cosmic energy, swirling with endless patterns of light and shadow. "What is it?" Thornton whispered, eyes wide in horror. "What does it want from us?" Hayes, who had been silently watching from the side, finally spoke, his voice trembling with both fear and understanding. "It doesn't want anything from us. It's not about us. It's just there. It's been here for eons, watching, waiting. And we're nothing but a distraction to it, a brief ripple in its existence. It's indifferent to us." Thornton looked at him, his heart pounding. "So we're just prey." "It doesn't even see us that way," Hayes replied softly. "We're like ants to it, insignificant, irrelevant. We've crossed into its territory, and now it's doing what it's always done, nothing personal. Just what it does." Carter's voice broke through the tension. "We have to stop it. We have to do something." "How?" Thornton shouted, the desperation in his voice growing. "What can we do? We've tried everything. Nothing works." Suddenly there was a new sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the entire ship. It was coming from deep within the hull, resonating from the core of the Eclipse. The crew turned toward the sound, their faces filled with confusion and fear. "What is that?" Carter asked, her eyes scanning the readings. "It's coming from inside the ship," Hayes said, his voice urgent. "This entity, it's somehow linked to the ship. It's not just outside. It's manipulating the Eclipse from within. It's trying to control us, trying to take over." The realization hit them all like a punch to the gut. The entity wasn't just an external force. They were connected to it. Their very ship was caught in its gravitational pull. The Eclipse was being consumed, piece by piece, by this ancient intelligence. The lights flickered again, and the hum grew louder, vibrating the walls around them. Thornton stumbled back from the console, his eyes wide with panic. "We have to escape. We have to get out of here before it pulls us in completely." Hayes looked at him, his eyes clouded with dread. "There is no escape. It's too late for that. It has us now." The ship shook once more, and the hum became a screeching sound, as if the very fabric of the Eclipse was being torn apart. The crew braced themselves, their hearts pounding in their chests as the walls groaned, the ship's systems fighting to stay alive. Outside, the entity began to manifest more clearly, its form growing larger, more defined. A vast, incomprehensible shape that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a creature. It was something far older, far more terrifying, an intelligence that had existed long before humanity ever reached the stars. And now, the fleet was nothing more than a fleeting memory to it, a brief interruption in its eternal existence. As the ship trembled again, the bridge crew knew that whatever fate awaited them, it was already sealed. The fleet, now reduced to a mere handful of ships, drifted deeper into the heart of the anomaly. The silence that pervaded the fleet was deafening, broken only by the hum of failing systems and the occasional desperate transmission. Despite the growing fear and uncertainty among the crew, Admiral Thornton's orders remained unwavering: push forward, explore, and complete the mission. His authority had been absolute, and even the most senior officers now hesitated to question him. But Dr. Lucas Hayes, the fleet scientist, could no longer sit idly by. The reality of what was happening had settled in his mind like a cold dread, and he couldn't shake the certainty that they were being drawn into something far older, far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. One night, as the fleet coasted deeper into the uncharted space, Hayes gathered a small group of officers, including Lieutenant Carter, the communications officer, and Commander Ethan Harper, the tactical officer. They met in secret, away from the prying eyes of the rest of the crew. Hayes couldn't risk the Admiral finding out. Thornton would never believe him, and he feared that revealing too much would only lead to even greater panic. But the truth was undeniable now. They had to act. "We're being hunted," Hayes said in a low, urgent voice as they gathered around a small table in the ship's briefing room. "This is no natural phenomenon. Something ancient is here, something powerful. I've been reviewing the readings from the remaining ships, and they all follow the same pattern. Disappearing without a trace, no wreckage, no debris, not even a signal." Carter looked around nervously. "You think it's an alien presence?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "But that doesn't make sense. We haven't found any evidence of extraterrestrial life in centuries." "I don't think it's a conventional species," Hayes replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "I've been analyzing the signals, the fluctuations. These aren't simple power surges or gravitational anomalies. This force, it's manipulating space itself. It's something far beyond any civilization we know, something older, maybe older than anything we've ever encountered." Harper leaned forward, his face shadowed with doubt. "Then why hasn't it destroyed us all? Why not just finish the job like it did to the others?" Hayes' eyes locked onto Harper's. "Because it doesn't need to. It's been here for eons, watching, waiting. We're just another blip in its existence, another distraction. And now we've come too close. The other ships were picked off, one by one, because they ventured too deep. We've crossed into its territory, and it's playing with us. It's studying us." The room fell silent as the officers processed Hayes' words. The fear was palpable now. No one had truly understood the danger until this moment. They weren't dealing with a hostile species or a natural disaster. They were facing an ancient intelligence, one whose motives were beyond their comprehension. Suddenly, the comm system crackled to life. It was a faint transmission, but this time there was no distortion, no static, just a calm, cold voice that seemed to echo in their minds rather than through the speakers. "Turn back." The voice was chilling, resonating with an authority that was impossible to ignore. The officers exchanged nervous glances, a collective realization dawning upon them. The voice came not from any ship, not from a person. They were hearing the entity itself. "Turn back before it's too late." It was then that Hayes understood. The fleet hadn't been lost to random disasters, nor had it simply been wiped out by a freak occurrence. This thing, whatever it was, had been guiding them to their doom all along. The fleet had fallen into its trap, and now it was playing with them. But it wasn't just the Admiral's orders keeping them on this course. It was humanity's pride, the belief that they could conquer anything, even forces beyond their comprehension. And with that belief, they had crossed the line. They had triggered something far more terrifying than any enemy they had ever faced. As the transmission faded, the cold voice still echoing in their minds, Hayes looked around the room at his fellow officers, realizing that no one in this fleet would be leaving alive unless something drastic changed. "I don't think we can turn back now," Hayes whispered, dread crawling up his spine. The entity was already waiting. As the fleet dwindled down to only a handful of ships, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The losses were mounting, but Admiral Thornton refused to accept what was happening. His pride, his belief in humanity's superiority, pushed him to ignore the growing panic within his ranks. A deep, unsettling silence fell over the fleet as it pressed forward, deeper into the anomaly. The only sounds aboard the remaining ships were the hum of systems still functioning, the buzz of the crew trying to maintain order in the midst of confusion, and the occasional voice crackling over the comms, uncertain and strained. Lieutenant Emma Carter, now the officer in charge of the Eclipse's communications, was growing increasingly uneasy. The strange signals that had been detected earlier were worsening, pulsing at irregular intervals, as though something was sensing with their every move. It was a pattern, but one she couldn't understand, something beyond the normal fluctuations of space. The distortion was now affecting not just their communications, but their sensors too. Systems on all ships were flickering. Shadows would appear in corners of view screens, then vanish before anyone could react. And yet, Admiral Thornton pressed forward. "We continue. No turning back." "Not now," Thornton repeated, as if reciting a mantra to both himself and his crew. He had promised a full exploration of this sector, and despite the mysterious losses, he refused to admit that their mission was anything but a success in progress. But as his words echoed through the ship, even he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that something was hunting them. The fleet was falling apart, one ship at a time, and yet they still moved forward. Then it happened again. The Eclipse, flagship of the fleet, received an unexpected transmission. The signal was faint, distorted by static, but it carried a single word: run. The voice was frantic, panicked, and just as quickly as it came, it vanished into the void. "Did anyone else hear that?" Carter asked, eyes wide as she looked around the bridge, hoping for some confirmation of the strange message. The comms officer nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. It came from the Lone Star. I can't explain it. It was like the ship was still there, but it wasn't." Thornton stiffened, his expression unreadable. His mind raced, but his voice remained steady. "A malfunction. That ship is gone. It's not coming back." The crew was no longer convinced by his dismissal. They'd seen too much, heard too many stories of unexplained disappearances to buy into the idea that it was simply equipment failure. The ship had been there one moment, then gone the next. But none of the remaining officers dared speak out. Thornton's rule was absolute. The anomaly that had already consumed so many of their comrades was now inescapable. The Lone Star wasn't the last to fall. Soon, the ardent flame was lost. Then the nightfall. Each disappearance followed the same eerie pattern. No distress signals, no wreckage, just silence. The fleet was breaking apart, and the survivors felt like rats in a maze, running toward an inevitable end. Dr. Lucas Hayes, his earlier warnings ignored, began to unravel in frustration. His suspicions had solidified into fear. Something vast, something beyond human comprehension, was hunting them. He finally confronted Thornton again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Admiral, can't you see? This isn't just an accident. We're being watched. The fleet, it's being picked off one by one. We have to leave. Now." Thornton's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening in defiance. "We don't retreat." "You're wrong, Dr. Hayes. The fleet is strong. We are strong." But Hayes could see the cracks in the Admiral's resolve, the flicker of doubt that no one dared acknowledge. The truth was inescapable. The fleet was being hunted by something older, more dangerous, and more intelligent than any of them could comprehend. As the remaining ships pressed on, the air in the command rooms grew heavy with tension. They could feel it. Something was coming. Something was already here. And they were running out of time.